Commander Vexhal stood at the massive viewing screen of the Dominator, watching another world burn beneath them. The planet below had once been home to 12 billion creatures that called themselves the Nexari. Now it was nothing more than a smoking reminder of what happened when species refused to surrender to the Zephyrian Empire. The Nexari had been different from most species the Empire encountered. Their bodies were made of living crystal that could change shape and color based on their emotions. When the Zephyrian fleet had first arrived in their system 3 months ago, the entire planet had turned a brilliant red color that meant defiance in their culture. Now the few survivors glowed a dim gray that meant complete defeat. Vexahal's own species looked nothing like the beautiful crystalline beings below. The Zephyrians were tall creatures with hard shells covering their bodies and forearms that ended in sharp claws. Their heads were long and narrow with large black eyes that could see in almost complete darkness. Most other species found them terrifying to look at, which had always worked in their favor during negotiations. The commander turned away from the viewing screen and walked across the bridge of his flagship. The Dominator was not just a warship, but a floating city that housed over 2 million Zephyrians. Its hull stretched for nearly 50 kilometers from front to back and was armed with weapons that could crack planets in half. The bridge alone was larger than most species' capital buildings, with hundreds of workstations arranged in perfect rows. "Report," Vexhal commanded as he approached his tactical officer. Sub-Commander Krelnex looked up from his station with eyes that glowed softly in the dim light. "The Nexari government has formally surrendered, sir. They are offering their entire mineral wealth and all technological research in exchange for allowing their remaining population to live." Vexhal nodded slowly. This was how it always ended. Every species in the galaxy eventually learned that resistance against the Zephyrian Empire was pointless. They had conquered over 10,000 worlds in the past 3,000 years, and not a single species had ever successfully fought them off. The secret to their success was simple. The Zephyrians did not just have better weapons or faster ships than other species, though they certainly had both. What made them truly unstoppable was their complete understanding of how war worked on a galactic scale. While other species thought in terms of individual battles or single campaigns, the Zephyrians planned their conquests across centuries. Every world they took was carefully chosen to support the next phase of their expansion. Planets rich in metals became shipyards that built more warships. Worlds with large populations provided soldiers and workers. Systems with advanced technology gave them new weapons and tools. Each conquest made the next one easier, and the empire grew stronger with every victory. The Zephyrians had also learned that the quickest way to end a war was to make it clear that resistance was hopeless. When they arrived at a new star system, they always brought enough firepower to destroy every planet and moon if necessary. Most species took one look at the massive fleet hanging in space above their worlds and decided that surrender was the smart choice. Those few species that chose to fight rarely lasted more than a few weeks. The Zephyrian military had studied every form of warfare practiced by thousands of different species. They knew how to counter every strategy, defeat every tactic, and break every defense. Their soldiers were trained from birth to fight, and their ships were built by the greatest minds in the galaxy. But it was not just their military might that made the Zephyrians so successful. They were also master diplomats who understood exactly how much pressure to apply and when to apply it. They never demanded that conquered species give up their culture or religion. They allowed local governments to continue ruling their own people as long as they followed Zephyrian laws. They even provided protection from other threats and helped improve technology on worlds that proved loyal. This approach meant that most conquered species actually lived better, lives under Zephyrian rule than they had before. Crime rates dropped because Zephyrian law enforcement was swift and effective. Trade flourished because the Empire provided safe passage between worlds. Scientific research advanced rapidly because information was shared freely across the entire galaxy. Vexhal had been born on one of the first worlds the Empire had conquered, and he knew firsthand how much life had improved under Zephyrian control. His own people had been primitive farmers before the conquest, barely capable of spaceflight. Now they were valued citizens of the greatest empire in galactic history, with access to technology and opportunities their ancestors could never have imagined. "Set course for the next target system," Vexhal ordered as he settled into his command chair. The chair was designed to accommodate his species' unique body shape, with supports for all forearms and a rest for his long tail. "Sir," Krelneck said as he consulted his navigation display. Intelligence reports indicate the next system contains a recently spacefaring species called humans. They achieved faster-than-light travel only 50 years ago and have established colonies on 12 worlds so far. Vexhal felt a familiar surge of anticipation. New species were always the most interesting to conquer because their reactions were unpredictable. Some begged for mercy before the Zephyrian fleet even entered their system. Others tried to hide on distant planets hoping they would be overlooked. A few actually attempted to fight, which usually provided brief entertainment for his crew. What do we know about their military capabilities? He asked. Krelnex pulled up a holographic display showing crude human spacecraft. Primitive by our standards, sir. They use chemical rockets for propulsion and kinetic weapons for combat. Their largest warships are less than 2 kilometers long and carry fewer than 1,000 crew members. Intelligence estimates their entire fleet consists of perhaps 300 vessels. The commander almost smiled at this information. The Dominator alone carried more firepower than the entire human fleet combined. His task force of 12 dreadnoughts and 40 escort ships would be more than enough to handle anything the humans might throw at them. How long until we reach their territory? Vexhal asked. Approximately 6 standard days at current speed, sir. Excellent. Send the usual surrender demand ahead of our arrival. Perhaps these humans will be smart enough to save us all some time. As the massive Zephyrian fleet changed course toward human space, Vexhal allowed himself to feel satisfied with another successful conquest. The Nexari had provided valuable resources that would fuel the next phase of expansion. And soon the humans would join the growing list of species that had learned to accept Zephyrian rule. He had no way of knowing that he was about to encounter something that had never existed before in the galaxy's long history of conquest and surrender. The Zephyrians were about to meet a species that simply did not understand the concept of hopeless odds. Captain Jake Morrison was drinking his morning coffee when the alert klaxon started screaming throughout the UES Defiance. He nearly spilled the hot liquid on his uniform as he rushed from his quarters to the bridge, his boots echoing loudly in the metal corridors of the ship. The Defiance was one of humanity's newest warships, built specifically for long-range patrol duties along the outer colonies, where pirates and raiders sometimes caused trouble. Morrison had been commanding the Defiance for 3 years, and in that time they had seen plenty of action against human criminals and the occasional hostile alien species that humanity had encountered during their expansion into space. But nothing had prepared him for what Lieutenant Amy Parker was about to show him on the main display screen. Captain. On the bridge, called out Ensign Roy Collins from the communications station as Morrison entered the command center. The bridge of the Defiance was small compared to the massive warships that Earth built for major fleet actions, but it was efficiently designed with every station within easy reach of the captain's chair. Report, Morrison said, as he settled into his command seat and looked around at his crew. These men and women had served with him through dozens of dangerous situations, and he trusted them completely. Parker turned from her tactical station with a confused expression on her face. Sir, we received a transmission about 10 minutes ago. It came from deep space outside our sensor range, but the signal was incredibly powerful, much stronger than anything we've seen from known alien species. Morrison felt a cold sensation in the pit of his stomach. First contact with new alien species was always dangerous, and humanity had learned to be very careful when dealing with unknown civilizations. Some aliens were peaceful traders who wanted nothing more than to exchange goods and knowledge. Others were aggressive warriors who saw humans as either threats to be destroyed or resources to be exploited. Put it on screen, he ordered. The main display flickered for a moment before showing the image of the most frightening creature Morrison had ever seen. The alien stood nearly 3 meters tall with a hard shell covering its entire body. 4 muscular arms ended in razor-sharp claws that looked capable of tearing through steel. Its head was long and narrow, with black eyes that seemed to stare directly into Morrison's soul. When the creature spoke, its voice was deep and harsh, but the words came through clearly in perfect English, thanks to some kind of advanced translation technology. I am Commander Vexhal of the Zephyrian Empire. Your species has been selected for incorporation into our territory. You have 72 hours to surrender all military forces and submit to Imperial authority. Resistance will result in the complete destruction of your civilization. The message ended abruptly, leaving the bridge of the Defiance in complete silence. Morrison stared at the blank screen for several long seconds before turning to look at his crew. Every face showed the same mixture of shock and disbelief that he was feeling. Collins was the first to speak. "Sir, should I relay this message to Earth Command?" "Do it immediately," Morrison replied. "Send it on the fastest quantum channel we have available. Command needs to see this right away." As Collins worked at his station, Morrison tried to process what he had just witnessed. The alien's message had been delivered with the casual confidence of someone who expected immediate obedience. There had been no attempt at negotiation or diplomacy, no explanation of terms or conditions. Just a simple demand for total surrender backed by the threat of annihilation. "Captain," Parker said from her station, "I'm detecting massive energy signatures at the edge of the system. Whatever sent that message is out there right now, and it's big." Morrison stood up and walked over to her tactical display. The readings showed power levels unlike anything in humanity's experience. The largest human warships generated enormous amounts of energy to power their weapons and shields. But these readings were off the scale. "How many ships are we looking at?" he asked. Parker shook her head. "It's hard to tell, sir. The energy signatures are so massive that they're interfering with our long-range sensors. I count at least 12 major contacts, possibly more. Each one is generating more power than our entire fleet combined." Morrison felt his jaw tighten as he absorbed this information. Humanity had built a respectable space navy over the past 50 years, with over 300 warships protecting Earth and the colonies. But if Parker's readings were accurate, the alien force waiting at the edge of the system could probably destroy every human ship in existence. "Sir," Collins called out, "I'm receiving a priority transmission from Earth Command." "Put it through," Morrison ordered as he returned to his command chair. Admiral Lisa Hayes appeared on the screen, her usually calm expression showing signs of strain. Hayes was one of humanity's most experienced military commanders, having served in the colonial wars that had established human control over their current territory. If she looked worried, the situation was even worse than Morrison had thought. "Jake," she said without preamble, "we received your transmission about the alien ultimatum. Every colony world in the system got the same message. How many ships are you detecting out there?" "At least 12 major warships, Admiral," Morrison replied. "Each one appears to be larger and more powerful than anything we've ever encountered. They're holding position at the edge of the system, probably waiting for our response." Hayes nodded grimly. "We're mobilizing the entire fleet, but it will take at least 48 hours to get significant reinforcements to your position. Can you maintain surveillance on the alien force until then?" Morrison looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew. They were all volunteers who had signed up to defend humanity against whatever threats they might encounter in space. None of them had expected to face an enemy this powerful, but none of them showed any signs of backing down. "We'll keep an eye on them." "Admiral," he said. "Good, and Jake, I want you to send a response to their ultimatum. Make it clear that humanity doesn't surrender to threats." Morrison felt a grim smile spread across his face. "What exactly should I tell them, ma'am?" Hayes was quiet for a moment before responding. "Tell them that humans fight." After the transmission ended, Morrison turned to Collins. "Open a channel to the alien fleet." "Channel open, sir." Morrison stood up and straightened his uniform. He knew that his next words might determine the fate of his entire species, but he also knew what his answer had to be. "This is Captain Jake Morrison of the United Earthship Defiance," he said in a clear, steady voice. "We have received your surrender demand. Our response is simple. We do not surrender to anyone. If you want to fight, we'll give you a fight you'll never forget." Commander Vexhal stared at the tactical display on the bridge of the Dominator, with what could only be described as amusement. The human response to his ultimatum had been recorded and played back 3 times already, and each viewing had brought more laughter from his crew. In 3,000 years of conquest, no species had ever responded to a Zephyrian surrender demand with such crude defiance. The single human warship that had delivered the message hung in space like a tiny insect challenging a storm. The UES Defiance measured barely 1 kilometer from bow to stern, making it smaller than most Zephyrian escort vessels. Its hull was made of primitive steel alloys that would probably melt under the first blast from Zephyrian energy weapons. The ship carried perhaps 1,000 crew members, while the Dominator alone housed over 2 million warriors. "Scan their vessel completely," Vexhal ordered his science officer. "I want to know everything about their weapons, shields, and propulsion systems before we destroy them." Subcommander Krellnex worked at his station for several minutes before looking up with confusion written across his alien features. Sir, their technology is incredibly primitive by our standards. They use chemical rockets for maneuvering and some kind of fusion reactor for main power. Their weapons appear to be kinetic railguns that fire metal projectiles and nuclear missiles with simple guidance systems. Vexhal felt his amusement growing. What about their defensive systems? Basic energy shields powered by their fusion reactor, Krellnex replied. The entire system generates less power than a single weapon turret on this ship. Their armor appears to be nothing more than layered metal plates. The commander turned to his tactical officer. How long would it take to destroy them with conventional weapons? Approximately 30 seconds, sir, came the immediate response. One barrage from our main batteries would be more than sufficient. Vexhal nodded slowly as he considered his options. The smart thing to do would be to destroy the human ship immediately, and then move on to bombard their colonies until the entire species surrendered. But something about the human captain's defiant message had caught his attention. In all his years of conquest, he had never encountered a species with such apparent disregard for overwhelming odds. Sir, his communications officer called out, we're receiving another transmission from the human vessel. Put it on screen, Vexhal commanded. Captain Morrison appeared on the display, standing on the bridge of his tiny warship, with his crew visible in the background. The human looked calm and determined despite facing certain death. Behind him, Vexhal could see other humans working at their primitive control stations, preparing their ship for battle. Commander Vexhal, Morrison said in a steady voice, I want to make something clear before this starts. We know we can't win against your fleet. Our ships are smaller, our weapons are weaker, and you outnumber us by thousands to one. But we're going to fight anyway because that's what humans do when someone threatens our freedom. The human captain paused for a moment, looking directly into the camera. You've probably conquered a lot of species who surrendered without a fight. We're not going to be one of them. We're going to make you work for every inch of space you take, and we're going to make sure you remember this battle for the rest of your lives. The transmission ended, leaving the bridge of the Dominator in silence. Vexhal found himself impressed despite the situation. He had heard surrender speeches from thousands of defeated enemies, but he had never heard anyone calmly explain why they were going to fight a hopeless battle. All ships, he commanded through the fleet communication system. Prepare for combat operations. Target the human vessel and await my order to fire. Across the Zephyrian fleet, massive weapon systems came online with deadly precision. 12 dreadnoughts and 40 escort ships turned their attention toward the single human warship that dared to challenge them. Energy readings spiked as shields powered up and weapon batteries charged for the coming battle. On the bridge of the Defiance, alarms were sounding as the crew prepared for what they all knew would be their final fight. Captain Morrison moved from station to station, checking on his people and making sure everyone understood their roles in the desperate plan he had developed. Amy, he said to Lieutenant Parker at the tactical station, are all weapons loaded and ready? Yes, sir, she replied without looking up from her controls. All railgun batteries are charged and we have a full load of nuclear missiles. I've also programmed our point defense systems to engage incoming fire automatically, Morrison nodded and moved to the engineering station, where Chief Petty Officer Sam Carter was monitoring the ship's power systems. How long can we maintain full power to weapons and shields? Maybe 6 hours if we shut down everything else, Carter replied. But sir, if they hit us with anything like what our sensors are reading, 6 hours won't matter. We'll be lucky to last 6 minutes. Then we make those 6 minutes count, Morrison said firmly. He walked to the center of the bridge and looked around at his crew. These men and women had followed him through 3 years of dangerous missions, and now they were about to follow him into a battle that none of them would survive. But not one person on the bridge showed any sign of fear or hesitation. Listen up, everyone, Morrison said in a voice that carried clearly throughout the bridge. In about 5 minutes, the biggest alien fleet in galactic history is going to try to blow us into atoms. We can't match their firepower, we can't outrun their ships, and we can't call for backup that will arrive in time to help us. He paused and looked each crew member in the eye. But we can show them what it means to fight humans. We can make them pay for every shot they fire and every meter of space they advance. We can prove that humanity doesn't bow down to anyone, no matter how big their fleet or how advanced their weapons. Parker looked up from her station with a grim smile. Contact bearing 270 Mark 15. All enemy ships are powering weapons and moving to attack formation. Morrison returned to his command chair and gripped the armrests tightly. All hands, this is the captain. Battle stations. Prepare to engage the enemy. The tactical display showed the Zephyrian fleet beginning its approach, massive ships moving with predatory grace toward their tiny human target. Energy readings climbed steadily as alien weapons prepared to unleash destruction on a scale that humanity had never witnessed. Incoming transmission from the enemy flagship, Collins reported. Let's hear it, Morrison said. Commander Vexhal's voice filled the bridge of the Defiance. Human vessel, this is your final opportunity to surrender. Power down your weapons and prepare to be boarded. Morrison stood up slowly and walked to the communication station. Open a channel. When the light indicated he was transmitting, Morrison spoke clearly and calmly. Commander Vexhal, this is Captain Jake Morrison. We decline your offer. If you want this ship, come and take it. The first Zephyrian energy blasts lit up space like miniature suns as they lanced toward the Defiance. Captain Morrison gripped his command chair as the ship's automated defense systems engaged, deploying clouds of metallic chaff and electronic countermeasures to confuse the incoming fire. Most of the alien shots missed their target, but several connected with the ship's shields in brilliant explosions that sent shockwaves through the hull. Shields down to 80%. Parker reported from her tactical station as she worked frantically to return fire. All weapons are responding, firing main railgun batteries now. The Defiance shuddered as its primary weapons discharged, sending streams of metal projectiles racing toward the nearest Zephyrian dreadnought at tremendous speed. The kinetic rounds struck the alien ship's shields and created ripples of energy across its protective barrier, but failed to penetrate the advanced defensive system. Morrison watched the tactical display as more enemy ships moved into firing position around his vessel. The Zephyrians were approaching cautiously, apparently surprised that the human ship was still intact after their first barrage. Their formation suggested they expected the battle to be over quickly, but they were taking no chances with their overwhelming numerical advantage. Target their shield generators, Morrison ordered. If we can't punch through their defenses, maybe we can overload them. Parker adjusted the ship's targeting systems and fired again, concentrating all available firepower on specific points along the alien ship's hull. The continuous bombardment began to stress the Zephyrian shields, causing fluctuations in their energy patterns that showed up clearly on the Defiance's sensors. On the bridge of the Dominator, Commander Vexhal watched his tactical displays with growing confusion. The human ship should have been destroyed in the first exchange of fire, yet somehow it was still fighting back and actually causing minor damage to his vessels. No species in the Empire's long history had ever managed to harm Zephyrian ships with such primitive weapons. How are they penetrating our shields? He demanded of his science officer. Krailnek studied his instruments carefully before responding. Sir, they're not using advanced technology to break through our defenses. Instead, they're concentrating sustained fire on single points until our shield generators overload from the continuous energy drain. It's a brute force approach that shouldn't work, but they're making it effective through sheer determination. Vexhal felt a strange sensation that took him a moment to identify as respect. The humans were fighting with tactics that no civilized species would ever consider. Rather than trying to match Zephyrian technology or find clever ways around their defenses, they were simply refusing to give up no matter how hopeless the situation became. Sir, his tactical officer called out, the human vessel is launching missiles. Dozens of nuclear warheads streaked away from the Defiance toward the Zephyrian fleet. Most were intercepted by point defense systems, but several managed to detonate close enough to enemy ships to cause electromagnetic interference with their sensor arrays. The humans were not trying to destroy the alien vessels with these attacks, but rather to blind them temporarily and create opportunities for more effective strikes. Morrison smiled grimly as he watched his plan unfold on the tactical screen. Humanity had learned the art of warfare through thousands of years of conflict against their own species, and those lessons were serving them well against an enemy that had grown accustomed to easy victories. The Zephyrians fought like a superior force that expected quick submission, but humans fought like desperate underdogs who had nothing left to lose. Chief Carter, Morrison called to his engineering officer, reroute all available power to the forward railgun array. I want maximum velocity on our next salvo. Aye, sir, Carter replied as he worked at his station. shutting down life support in non-essential sections and reducing artificial gravity to minimum levels. That should give us about 20% more power for weapons. The ship shuddered again as another wave of Zephyrian fire struck their shields, this time dropping their defensive strength to just 40%. Warning lights flashed across the bridge as damage reports came in from throughout the vessel. But the crew continued working with calm efficiency despite the deteriorating situation. Direct hit on their secondary shield generator, Parker reported with satisfaction. Enemy vessel's defensive strength is down by 15% in that sector. Morrison nodded and studied the tactical display carefully. The Zephyrian fleet was beginning to tighten its formation around the Defiance, probably preparing for a coordinated assault that would overwhelm the human ship's defenses. But their cautious approach was giving him time to implement the desperate strategy he had been planning since the battle began. All hands, this is the captain, he announced over the ship's communication system. Prepare for emergency acceleration. We're going to ram the nearest enemy vessel. The bridge crew looked at him with expressions of determination rather than fear. They all understood that their ship was doomed regardless of what tactics they used, so they might as well try to inflict maximum damage on the enemy before they died. Sir, Collins called from the communications station. I'm receiving a priority transmission from Earth Command. Put it through, Morrison replied as he continued monitoring the approaching alien ships. Admiral Hayes appeared on the main screen, her face showing the strain of coordinating humanity's response to the Zephyrian threat. Jake, we've been monitoring your battle through long-range sensors. The entire fleet is moving to your position, but we're still 6 hours away. Understood, Admiral, Morrison said calmly. We'll hold them here as long as possible. Hayes leaned forward with an expression of fierce pride. Captain, every human colony in the system is watching this fight. You're showing the entire galaxy what it means to be human. No matter what happens next, you've already won the most important victory. The transmission ended just as the Zephyrian fleet launched its coordinated assault. Hundreds of energy beams converged on the Defiance from every direction, overwhelming its shields and tearing into the ship's hull with devastating effect. Explosions rocked the bridge as systems overloaded, and structural supports began to fail. Hull breach on decks 7 through 12, Parker reported as she fought to keep her station operational. We've lost main power to the aft weapons array. Morrison felt the ship beginning to break apart around him, but he refused to give up. Emergency power to engines. Full acceleration toward the enemy flagship. The dying human warship lurched forward with its remaining thrusters, racing toward the massive Zephyrian dreadnought that had been leading the attack. Morrison knew they would never reach their target, but he was determined to get as close as possible before the end. Sir, Carter called out with his voice barely audible over the sounds of destruction. Reactor containment is failing. We have maybe 2 minutes before total core breach. Morrison looked around his bridge one final time at the faces of his crew. These brave men and women had followed him into an impossible battle without hesitation, and now they were going to die together in the cold vacuum of space. But they had proven something important to themselves and to the watching galaxy. Set reactor for manual detonation, he ordered quietly. If we're going down, we're taking some of them with us. The explosion that ended the UES Defiance lit up the darkness of space like a newborn star. Captain Morrison had triggered the ship's fusion reactor to overload just as the dying vessel reached point-blank range with the Zephyrian flagship. The blast was not powerful enough to destroy the massive alien dreadnought, but it sent shockwaves through the enemy formation and left the Dominator crippled and dead in space. Commander Vexahal found himself trapped in the twisted wreckage of his bridge, his carapace cracked and bleeding from multiple wounds. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows across the destroyed command center as his surviving crew worked frantically to restore basic ship functions. The mighty vessel that had conquered 1,000 worlds was now nothing more than a floating piece of debris. Damage report, Vexhal managed to say through the pain as medical officers worked to stabilize his injuries. Sub-Commander Krellnex looked up from a portable status display with shock written across his features. Sir, main power is completely offline. Weapon systems are destroyed. Life support is running on emergency batteries that will last perhaps 6 hours. We need immediate assistance from the rest of the fleet. Vexhal tried to process this information as medical technicians applied emergency treatment to his wounds. One primitive human warship with outdated weapons and basic shields had done more damage to Zephyrian forces than entire star nations had managed in previous wars. It seemed impossible, yet the evidence was all around him in the form of his destroyed flagship. "What about the rest of the task force?" he asked weakly. "4 escort vessels were caught in the explosion and suffered major damage," Krelnex replied. "The remaining ships are undamaged but shaken. The crews are asking for orders, sir." Before Vexhal could respond, his communications officer called out from across the ruined bridge. "Sir, we're receiving emergency transmissions from across the Empire. Something is happening on the conquered worlds." The commander felt a cold sensation that had nothing to do with his physical injuries. "What kind of transmissions?" "Rebellion, sir," came the quiet response. "The crystalline Nexari have risen up against our occupation forces. They're using improvised weapons and tactics similar to what the humans just demonstrated. Our garrison commanders are requesting immediate reinforcements." Vexhal closed his eyes as the full scope of the disaster began to dawn on him. The battle with the human ship had been broadcast across all Zephyrian communication networks as a routine demonstration of imperial power. Instead, billions of conquered beings had watched a single primitive vessel hold off the entire Zephyrian fleet for hours before finally succumbing. They had seen proof that the Empire could be hurt, that Zephyrian ships could be damaged, that resistance was possible. "Sir," the communications officer continued, "we're also receiving reports from the Altarian system. The local population has declared independence and is attacking our administrative centers. They're calling it the human method of warfare." More reports flooded in over the next few hours as Vexhal lay recovering in the medical bay of a rescue ship. The gas giant dwellers of Typhon Prime had converted their mining equipment into weapons and were fighting Zephyrian patrol ships throughout their system. The insectoid Veltar had organized guerrilla attacks against occupation forces on 17 different worlds. Even the thoroughly subjugated Corvani were staging uprisings in their major cities. Every species that had peacefully accepted Zephyrian rule for decades or even centuries was suddenly remembering what it felt like to be free. They had all seen the same broadcast of a tiny human warship refusing to surrender against impossible odds, and they wanted to learn how to fight with that same desperate courage. The tactical reports that reached Vexhal painted a picture of an empire in rapid collapse. Zephyrian military doctrine was based on overwhelming superiority and quick victories against demoralized enemies. Their forces were not equipped or trained to handle prolonged insurgencies across thousands of different worlds simultaneously. Garrison troops that had grown soft from years of peaceful occupation found themselves facing determined rebels who fought with human-inspired tactics. Within 6 months, over half the Empire's territory was in open revolt. The Zephyrian fleet was stretched impossibly thin, trying to maintain control over their vast domain, while dealing with constant attacks from species that had learned to fight like humans. Ships that had once been symbols of unstoppable power were being destroyed by converted mining vessels and improvised weapons built in hidden workshops across the galaxy. The worst part for Vexhal was reading the intelligence reports about how the rebellions were being organized. The humans had somehow managed to broadcast their battle across the entire galaxy, complete with tactical analysis and detailed explanations of their fighting methods. Species that had never considered military resistance were now studying human warfare and adapting those lessons to their own situations. The message that accompanied these broadcasts was simple but devastating to Zephyrian authority. The humans claimed that freedom was worth any sacrifice, that no species should bow to tyrants regardless of their technological advantages, and that courage could overcome any odds if enough beings were willing to fight for what they believed in. A year after the destruction of the Defiance, Vexhal found himself commanding a much smaller fleet assigned to defend the Zephyrian home system against approaching human forces. The mighty empire that had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years controlled less than 100 worlds, and that number was shrinking every day as more species joined the growing alliance of free peoples. The humans had done more than win a single battle or inspire a few rebellions. They had fundamentally changed how the entire galaxy thought about power and resistance. Species that had accepted Zephyrian rule as a natural law of the universe now understood that empires could fall and tyrants could be defeated. Admiral Lisa Hayes stood on the bridge of the UES Vengeance, flagship of humanity's expanded fleet, as they approached the former Zephyrian capital. The massive human battle group included ships from dozens of different species, all flying under the banner of the Galactic Freedom Alliance that had formed in the wake of Captain Morrison's sacrifice. "Sir," her tactical officer reported, "the Zephyrian Defense Fleet is requesting terms for surrender." Hayes thought about Jake Morrison and his crew, who had died believing they were fighting a hopeless battle against an unstoppable enemy. They had never lived to see the liberation of the galaxy that their courage had made possible, but their sacrifice had sparked the greatest revolution in galactic history. "Tell them," Hayes said quietly, "that we accept their surrender. The Age of Empires is over." Commander Vexhal watched from his command deck as human ships took control of his home system. The species he had dismissed as primitive barbarians had taught the galaxy that freedom was not something to be granted by superior powers, but something to be fought for by anyone brave enough to stand up against tyranny. The Zephyrian Empire was finished, brought down not by superior technology or overwhelming force, but by one simple idea that humans had shared with the galaxy. Sometimes the most important battles are not the ones you can win, but the ones you refuse to lose.